Rachel, a 32-year-old financial analyst, secretly buys a lakeside home she's sacrificed for. Days after closing, her brother Owen and his family break into the house and throw a new home party, claiming it as theirs. Rachel uses security footage and legal paperwork to prove ownership, involves police and a lawyer, and stands firm despite family pressure to share. The conflict escalates into social media attacks, legal maneuvers, and emotional blackmail. Rachel secures restraining orders, pursues professional discipline for the agent who leaked information, and chooses chosen family for her housewarming. The ending is bittersweet. She keeps the house but loses some family intimacy. She gains self-respect and healthier boundaries. The alert buzzed like an insect under glass. For a second Rachel thought it was the trash truck outside, then the thumbnail image on her phone stole the breath from her chest. Party balloons smeared across the living room ceiling, a banner sagging over the fireplace, the flash of a champagne flute catching light where only morning sunlight should have been. She tapped the notification, audio spilled from the speaker, high laughter, the clink of glasses, her brother's voice booming a toast. "Owen," he said, unmistakable. Warmth in his voice she had learned to read, performative, polished, practiced. He announced new beginnings as if he had authored them. And he was standing barefoot on her reclaimed hardwood, a house full of people who had no right to be there. Heather, perched on the island like a queen surveying a kingdom that didn't belong to her, caught Rachel's eye from the screen and smiled in triumph. Rachel sank until the drywall pressed into her shoulder blades. She tasted metal like she always did when anger reached a kind of precision. She thought of late nights and consulting weekends, the spreadsheet rows that had become bricks. 5 years of not yet and later, and the deed, hot from the closing table 3 days ago, sat in her glove compartment, the ink of her name still crisp. She had wanted the reveal to be hers. She had wanted the first time to be quiet, private, a ritual of belonging. Instead, the house had been colonized. She could feel the absurdity of standing in her downtown office holding the tiny live stream of a scene that had been meticulously converted into someone else's narrative. She scrolled frantically, replaying a child sprinting across the floor toward a family member who laughed like the house already belonged to him. The neighbor had texted the alert, "I think your place is having a party," with a string of worried emojis. She answered at once, "Call the police. Now." The drive to Willowbrook Lane emptied her head into a single animal clarity. Gravel under tires, the lake's surface black and placid, the house itself sitting calm under a late summer sky like a promise hoarded. Police lights through the siding in red and blue as she pulled into a cautious, observant space across the street, crime scene cool in the night air. Through the officer's tablet the footage danced, a family celebrating on her floors, playing house where she had only just learned to claim her own. When she stepped onto the porch, Owen's practiced smile had the slight tremor of a man who had been caught mid-performance. "Rachel," he said, as if entering into a script he had not actually rehearsed. He gestured through the doorway at his assembled cast, damp with the scent of cheap wine and entitlement. Her reply was slow and small. She handed the officer the folder. Mortgage docs. Wire receipts. The deed with her signature. Each page was a pin that anchored reality back to itself. The officer skimmed and looked up at her with that bureaucratic kindness that lands somewhere between sympathy and procedure. "Miss Bennett," he said, returning the papers, "the documents are clear." Owen's charm frayed, a shadow crossed his face. For an instant his eyes were not theatrical at all, just a man sensing the edges of a plan crumbling. Heather's laughter hitched, and a little one nearby sniffed, confused by the sudden seriousness. The party unwound into the shuffling dirt of embarrassment, relatives' murmurs like the rustle of cheap streamers. As they were led out, balloons wobbling, Rachel lingered in the doorway and watched a child's drawing stuck to her fridge, a scribbled house with stick figures, captioned "Our New Home." She peeled it off. Her hands shook, but not with fear, with the cold, private satisfaction of a boundary being drawn in a house that would now be fought over. She opened a window, letting the lake's breath move through the rooms as if to cleanse them of someone else's assumption. That night, standing on the deck with the lake and her pulse quieting, she didn't know yet if the victory would hold. But she felt, in the marrow of her certainty, this simple truth: the house was hers, and she would protect that fact as if it were the last thing she had left. The rest would follow. The next morning the storm arrived in texts, polite at first, then sharp. Owen is devastated. Dad, call us. Cousin Vivian, you embarrassed the family. Each ping felt like small glass tapping against a window, loud, repeated, impossible to ignore. The house wore the silence of an animal that had just been startled. Boxes sat half open in corners, a lamp unwrapped and leaning, as if it had been waiting for company it didn't ask for. Rachel read and didn't respond. Replies would have been performances she didn't need. Instead she built. The plate of lemon curd she'd brought home for herself found a place on the counter. A set of framed prints, a stack of dog-eared novels, a tea kettle that had been a reward. With each item she placed, the house felt a fraction more hers. She moved like someone marking territory, not with signs but with small acts of possession, folding towels, aligning books on the shelf, testing the shower's pressure. These were not grand gestures, but they were deliberate. They were the slow, quiet work of reclamation. When her parents knocked on the door with faces trained in practiced disappointment, Rachel expected heat. Instead she found the old scripts: a mom's smoothing voice, dad's reproachful brow. You could have discussed it, her mother said, as if closing on a house should be a family event. It's big for one person. The phrasing carried the assumption that her labor should yield to a communal comfort. That belief had always been the most corrosive thing in their family, the idea that generosity meant abdication. You heard about it, how? Rachel asked, and the answer, Cousin Jennifer's friend, a real estate agent who'd whispered, felt like a simple, obscene betrayal. The agent would later be a focal point for anger and complaint, but here the hurt was primarily human, wound opening to the sound of someone else deciding the shape of Rachel's life. Owen's messages arrived later that day, soft pedal diplomacy wrapped around guilt. We're struggling, Ratch. You could help. He attached a photo of his kids perched on a threadbare couch, a clever emotional photograph meant to spark concession. The view it asked for was not a legal concession. It was the one that had haunted her childhood, the assumption that she, with her steadiness and savings, would supply the extras for the sake of family harmony. She sat with the urge to crumble. It arrives sometimes as a small, moth-wing whisper at the base of the throat, a memory of herself handing over credit for the science fair robot she built while Owen accepted awards. Her life had been a series of those moments, her competence minimized and presented as communal treasure that others could help themselves to. Tonight, though, she placed the image of the kids at the edge of the coffee table and closed the folder of deeds until it made a soft thud. She would not be rerouted into the familiar cul-de-sac of guilt. Her lawyer said the obvious things and the procedural things: gather everything, document the harassment, don't engage publicly. But the social pressure had weight. Friends she hadn't spoken to in months messaged carefully worded questions. An old classmate posted an article about hoarding space with the tag dead parent energy or some such moralizing line that made Rachel sick. The internet knows how to make verdicts simple. It also knows how to weaponize one-liners. Meanwhile, at the house, she installed one more camera. One more little black eye watching the path to the driveway. She taught herself the cold vocabulary of protection, affidavits, restraining orders, service of process. It was useful language for someone intent on defending more than property, defending dignity. On a humid afternoon, Owen asked to meet. He suggested a public space, Riverside Cafe, noon, neutral ground. She said yes for reasons she didn't allow herself to name: finality, perhaps, or the desire to see the man who had cajoled his way into her living room look her in the eye. At the cafe, the world moved around them, clatter and steam, the caffeinated hum of people who had not spent their nights writing legal timelines in their heads. Owen sat like a politician between sips, his charm polished for negotiation. But when conversation slid into history, their history, Rachel felt her resolve deepen. She would not trade the night's clear victory for a fable of family sharing. She would not let the story return to the old default where her labor became communal property. The fabrics of their shared past, bargains, accolades taken, apologies half-made, lay between them like old quilts. He wanted them pulled over a new bed. She had no interest in lending warmth to a theft. The meeting ended on a cliff of civility. He warned of consequences, she warned of law. They both left thinking they had said the last word. Neither was right. If the story had been a single arc, this would be the sharp turn where the ground dropped away. A week after the cafe, when the storm of texts and exasperated voicemails had settled into background static, Rachel received a packet from the county assessor, not about zoning, not a tax notice. It was a formal complaint filed by someone using her name, claiming unpaid HOA fees and a clerical error in the deed paperwork. The language was bland and official, but each paragraph pressed like a thumb into the soft center of her certainty. Someone had tried to create legal fog. The thought made her dizzy. Not only had they staged a party, not only had the family tried to gaslight the narrative, but they had now moved to weaponize paperwork. For the first time since the initial incursion, fear appeared at the edges of her resolve, not the catch-your-breath, white-hot anger of discovery, but the slow-blooming dread that comes when systems are manipulated. Her lawyer called it a quiet tactic, delay, annoyance, the creation of administrative knots that cost time and money to untie. They're trying to make staying harder than leaving, her counsel said in a voice that would have been useful in a courtroom or a war room. They'll make it social, legal, emotional, all at once. Rachel changed her wallpaper to a photo of the lake at dawn, a private ritual, and then called the agent who had leaked her information. She demanded an explanation. The agent stuttered through corporate doublespeak. I didn't mean, it was casual, I thought. The casual leak became a formal complaint to the state board. Once exposure made it institutional, the agent's slip turned into evidence. Still, the complaint against Rachel was an ugly shadow that required immediate tending. As the administrative letters accumulated, an unexpected ally surfaced, Aunt Diane. She'd always been peripheral, the relative nobody paid attention to at holiday tables. But Diane texted privately, "You did nothing wrong. If you want, I'll testify about the agent's call." The gesture was small but seismic, a quiet, non-performative solidarity that cut through the louder chorus of family condemnation. At the same time, Owen's behavior escalated in ways more passive-aggressive than theatrical. His car idled outside her driveway for exactly 17 minutes on 3 consecutive nights. The first night she called out of habit. The second night she watched the surveillance playback and saw him pacing near the lake, a hand in his pocket. The third night she called the sheriff and filed for a restraining order based on pattern behavior that felt harassing. The judge granted it with that merciful speed that sometimes blesses those who record their lives, a temporary protection that felt like paper armor. The legal wins were not the same as ease. The family's social campaign had teeth. A friend posted an opinion piece, "Why hoarding space is unneighborly," and it threaded into Rachel's feeds with comments from people she barely remembered. The question that stung was not just whether she would keep the house, it was whether isolation might be the cost of standing for ownership. Then came the text from a blocked number, "You'll regret this." The menace was clumsy but effective. And it revealed a more dangerous undercurrent. When family lines are crossed, grievance metastasizes into something that can take forms she had not intended to fight. She had prepared for legal scrimmage, but not always for the quiet erosion of safety by presence, the car in the driveway, the surveilled night, the blocked messages. Still, the twist didn't crush her. It redirected. Instead of reacting only with legal posture, she leaned into relationships that felt real, coworkers who had covered her shifts, friends who delivered casseroles unbidden, the neighbor who had messaged the first alert. She began to host small gatherings, not housewarmings but quiet evenings of shared food where conversation shifted from family gossip to brunch plans and paperback swaps. Trust accumulated in the room like light. The midpoint had moved the story from "this is mine" to "what must I defend to keep my life whole?" It sharpened stakes beyond property, safety, reputation, chosen family. And in the shadow of that question, Rachel changed her strategy, no longer just proof and paperwork. Now this was also about building an unassailable life that could not be argued away. After the restraining order and the administrative flurry, the tempo of conflict intensified. What had been a public debate among relatives became a campaign of reputation. Owen and Heather pivoted to social media with photos staged to tug at sentiment, cramped apartment frames, kids with crooked smiles, captions about sacrifice. It was clumsy theater designed to make Rachel look as if she'd denied family the basics. The campaign spread like a smear, old classmates shared posts, distant acquaintances took sides, and her inbox filled with the polite fury of people who had never met her. Rachel resisted the reflex that had defined so many prior concessions, the urge to placate, to smooth, to give. Instead she documented. Each message, each comment, she screenshot and filed. She became surgical in her responses, a single statement to her lawyer, a terse reply when necessary, and otherwise silence. The silence was not cowardice, it was a refusal to play the virality game. The judge's temporary order remained in place and the county complaint against the agent was proceeding. Yet legal assurances felt thin against the daily drip of accusation. One late afternoon she received a call from a news producer. "We're doing a piece on entitled heirs," the producer said, voice airy and blue light casual. The invitation was a trap, sensationalism sells. She declined. There would be no public spectacle. Her story was not fodder. Then, in the quiet before the storm, a small miracle, a neighbor who'd been watching the entire time, an older man named Marcus who walked his terrier every dawn, dropped off a tray of cookies and a handwritten note, "You stood up for yourself. That matters." The note was a small thing, but it carried weight. It affirmed that the life she was building in that house had observers who understood nuance rather than headlines. The legal battle tightened. Depositions were scheduled. Her lawyer advised patience. But the family's strategy deepened, a request for mediation, a call for a family meeting with the parents as arbitrators, and subtle threats of escalating ostracism. Mom's voice cracked in a voicemail begging for reconciliation. Dad left a message invoking Grandpa's name like a cudgel. Their language leaned on tradition and the myth of shared inheritance, emotional levers meant to open cracks. The day before the mediation, Owen drove past her house and left a small package on the porch, a child's toy and an envelope with a short letter. The toy, a dinosaur with one plastic eye, sat on her welcome mat like a taunt. The letter, printed on plain paper, said simply, "We want peace. We can make this work. Don't force us into court." The note should have been conciliatory. It read instead like a bargain, comply and the social cost would fade. Don't, and the family's public pressure would escalate into the kind of sustained ostracism that had felled others in their social circles. Rachel read it twice, then folded it into the folder with the deed and the restraining order paperwork. Peace offered in the shadow of coercion was not peace at all. Mediation day arrived. A neutral office, neutral chairs, a neutral table. Her parents sat on either end like weathered bookends. Owen tried to smile. Heather lingered at the periphery, watchful. The mediator's voice was clinical, "Let's keep to procedure," and for a moment the room became small and soft with possibility. Owen's argument was practiced, family tradition, children needing space, the symbolic value of having a family house. He spoke as if the house were a common pot rather than a hard-earned, individually purchased place. Rachel's counter was precise. She presented timelines, savings ledgers, wire confirmations, and the chain of ownership. She spoke in deeds and in small, human moments, how long she'd worked, the nights she'd missed, the plan she'd held quietly for years. The mediator nodded, not about right and wrong, but about the practicality of solutions. What the mediator could not account for, though, was the emotional geometry of the room, whether family could release the demand to take and whether Rachel could keep without losing the people she loved. The mediation closed with no resolution, and the next day a terse exchange of emails set a trial date months away. The calm after felt like waiting on a ledge. That night, alone in her kitchen, Rachel lit a lamp and poured a glass of wine she could finally afford. The house hummed with the echo of voices that were, for now, hers. She walked from room to room, touching the spine of books she had shelved, feeling the weight of choices she'd made. The climax was approaching, not a single blaze, but a convergence, legal docket, family rupture, her own resolve. She could feel the pressure coalescing into a singular point. It would either be the night she lost more than property, or the night she crystallized everything she'd become. The trial day arrived with the grayness of a courtroom morning, filtered light, the smell of old upholstery, the dull murmur of people finding seats. Owen wore a navy suit that suggested seriousness. Heather's anxious energy hovered beside him like a dark scarf. Rachel entered alone, file folder taut in her hands, and felt eyes, kin and stranger, take measure. The gallery held relatives who had chosen sides and a few curious outsiders, a neighbor, Aunt Diane, a coworker who had taken the day off to sit in the third row. It was an odd congregation, people who had been actors in the earlier scenes and now played jury. The judge was patient in the way of those who have heard many permutations of human grievance. The county's claim against her had been dismissed after a brief inquiry into the agent's conduct. The restraining order remained in place due to documented patterns. What the court needed to adjudicate now was an urgent motion, Owen's petition to declare a family interest based on verbal promises and family history, a claim he had couched in nostalgia and need. The hearing was not about who hosted Christmas, it was about whether personal claims could override recorded, legal ownership. Owen's lawyer spoke first, an argument framed in empathy. He believed, Your Honor, that this house would be a place for his family. A verbal understanding among siblings, a promise. He painted a picture of children and gatherings and inexpensive tables where laughter trumped deed. It was seductive rhetoric for anyone who grew up in families where promises were currency. Rachel's side was meticulous. She displayed wire transfers, affidavits from the closing attorney, timestamps on the security footage showing the party. More than documents, she stepped forward and spoke. Her voice was steady, not raw. She recounts, briefly, precisely, the nights of overtime, the car sold, the weekends of consulting. She did not embellish and she did not denigrate Owen, she described facts that only tethered itself to truth. Then, unexpectedly, Owen's demeanor folded. In cross-examination he flinched when asked why he had entered the property. He had rehearsed charm and outrage, but his answers came out smaller. I thought it would be a surprise, he admitted. I didn't think she would press charges. It got out of hand. For a breath, the courtroom held a human note, not full remorse, but a crack in entitlement. The turning point came when Aunt Diane was called to testify. She spoke softly and with an authority that felt like truth-telling. The agent had bragged about being the inside contact. She'd heard that the agent had mentioned the lakeside property at a family get-together, calling it a gift waiting to be shared. Her testimony shifted the frame from family lore to an actual, actionable breach. The agent was reckless, the family narrative built on that leak was false from its foundation. The judge's pen paused over the papers. He did what judges do when motions are clear, he applied the law to fact. Ownership remained Rachel's. The court found no legal basis for a family claim. The restraining order was extended, the county reprimanded the agent. It was not a theatrical unmasking, no dramatic confession from Owen, but it was a firm legal confirmation. The law supported what the documents had always shown. Outside the courthouse, the press gathered, a handful of local outlets, but the public spectacle fizzled into dull reporting about family disputes and property law. What mattered occurred in quieter transactions. Rachel walked out the door and saw her father waiting in the car. He looked older, smaller. There was no movie-style reconciliation. Instead, he handed her a folded photograph of their grandfather with a note, proud. It was an ancestral approval she had not expected. Owen approached last, after the crowd had thinned. He looked at her with something like regret. I'm sorry, he said simply. The words were small, but they were realer than any of the speeches he had given earlier. Rachel's reply was measured. You hurt people, she said. You crossed a line. He nodded. There was no embrace. There was, however, an unspoken recognition that whatever family they had would not be the same. The house remained hers, the cost had been a redefinition of kinship. That evening, back on her deck as dusk gathered over the lake, Rachel felt both exhausted and oddly unburdened. The climax had not been a victory parade, it had been a legal and emotional severing that left a scar with a clean edge. She had won the house, and in the process had traded certain easy comforts for the solidity of standing for herself. It was a new kind of inheritance, not one passed down, but one claimed and defended. The healing after conflict arrived in small, domestic increments. Paperwork was filed, fines paid, and restitution sought from the agent. Owen and Heather moved into a modest house across town, not a reconciliation so much as a reordering. Christmas that year had two tables, one with the relatives who had remained loyal to tradition, one at Rachel's with friends who had shown up when it mattered. They were not a replacement for family, but they were family by choice, colleagues who brought slow-cooked casseroles, a neighbor who left jars of plums on her stoop, Aunt Diane who stopped by with stories that had no agenda. The house softened into lived-in rhythms. Mornings had the clink of a kettle and the soft sound of pages turning, evenings held the light from the fireplace as if it were a private lighthouse. Rachel learned to touch the house without thinking of it as a fortress. The camera feeds still pinged, occasionally, harmless shadows or a raccoon on the deck, and each alert felt less like an invasion and more like a managed hum of security. There were losses that could not be bargained back. Invitations went unanswered, and some doors remained closed forever. The family Christmas under different roofs was a real ache, but in other rooms laughter carried differently, not forced into the accommodating architecture she used to inhabit but chosen and earned. It was the geometry of belonging recalibrated. One evening, months later, her neighbor Marcus knocked with a newspaper under his arm. They ran a little piece on you, he said, handing it over. It was the local paper, and the article framed the story as a test of boundaries in modern families, less about property, more about respect. She read it and felt an uncomfortable flare of relief. The public had perhaps shifted from scorning to curiosity, then to a sort of begrudging agreement. The social media vitriol had dissipated into the white noise of the internet. Owen called sporadically over the months, terse messages that alternated between apology and resentful silence. They met once, after much negotiation, at a bench by the lake. Conversation there was fractured but civil. He had a toddler tucked to his chest, hair forever asking for a comb, and he looked tired in a real way. They each said the things they could say, owning mistakes in small gestures, promising to respect boundaries in larger ones. There was no neat reunion, but there was the slow work of a siblinghood that would have to be redefined. In a letter to the state board about the agent's ethics violation, Rachel wrote simply, "Trust should be earned, not assumed." The reprimand arrived with bureaucratic finality. The agent's license was docked, the clerk's stamp was a small, satisfying thud. But the deeper change was in the house itself, the way it became the site of firsts that belonged to Rachel exclusively. A quiet Saturday morning reading by the window. A dinner where friends lingered long into the night. A day when she finally hung a portrait of herself, smiling, above the mantel. It was a private collection of moments that constituted a life. At the edge of spring she sat on the dock and watched a heron lift from the water, its wings slow and precise. A child's kite bobbed on the distance, an ordinary human artifact in a broad wilderness. The lake reflected a sky that looked like a hand open to possibility. She felt both the ache of what had been severed and the strange, solid joy of what had been kept. When her phone buzzed with yet another attempt at reconciliation from a cousin's number, she let it go to voicemail. She listened later, not with the need to respond, but with the calm assessment of someone who had set a boundary and learned what it cost and what it bought. The message ended with a plea, thin and brittle, "Can we just be family again?" Rachel closed her eyes and pictured the house at night, lights warm, windows closed, the lock neatly turned. Maybe, she thought, finally honest with herself, but not the way you remember. Then she stood, walked inside, and turned up the music low enough to hear the hum of the refrigerator. Outside, fireflies dotted the yard like small promises. Inside, the house exhaled. It belonged to her, a geography of hard-won peace. And in that quiet, she understood that some victories are not about the vanquishing of others, but the preservation of the self.